16th, 1959. 6:47 in the morning. Signal Hill, St. John's, Newfoundland. Thomas Parsons pulled on his work boots in the dark, the way he did every winter morning. Outside, the wind was picking up. Nothing unusual. St. John's was a city that had made peace with weather the way sailors make peace with the sea. Grudgingly, practically, never completely. He drank his tea. He laced his boots. He opened the front door. The snow hit him in the face like a wall. Not falling snow. Level equals strong greater than horizontal snow. A white, roaring fury that pressed against the doorframe and erased the street completely. His fence posts were already buried to their tops. His truck? Gone. Just a smooth, white mound where it had been, a shape that suggested a vehicle the way a shroud suggests a body. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, then slowly closed the door. He didn't go to work that day. Nobody did. To understand what happened to St. John's in February 1959, you need to understand what kind of place St. John's already was. It sits at the eastern tip of Newfoundland, pressed against the Atlantic like it's daring the ocean to do its worst. It is the oldest English-founded city in North America, or so its residents will tell you, and they'll tell you often. Founded as a fishing outpost in the 1500s, battered by storms across 5 centuries, it has the bones of a city that expects hardship and builds accordingly. The houses are painted brilliant colors, reds and yellows and deep blues, partly for tradition and partly, some say, so fishermen could spot them through fog. St. John's averages over 300 centimeters of snow per year. That's more than almost anywhere else in eastern Canada, more than Toronto, more than Montreal, more than Ottawa. Snow is not a disruption to life in St. John's, it is a condition of life, which is why February 1959 was different. The days before the storm were deceptively quiet. A low-pressure system was tracking up the American eastern seaboard, pulling cold Arctic air south and warm Atlantic moisture north, the two forces compressing into the kind of meteorological collision that produces something biblical. The Weather Bureau issued advisories. Heavy snowfall expected, winds gusting to 80 kilometers per hour. Residents were told to prepare for difficult travel conditions. Level equals moderate, difficult travel conditions. When the storm finally arrived, and meteorologists would later calculate it struck with the full force of a Category 1 hurricane, minus the warmth, it didn't build gradually, it descended. At 5:30 in the morning of February 16th, the wind speed at the monitoring station above the harbour was 40 kilometers per hour. By 7 a.m., it was 110. By 9 a.m., visibility across the entire city was 0. Absolute 0. You could hold your hand in front of your face and lose it. The snow itself fell at a rate that instruments, in 1959, were barely calibrated to measure. Estimates placed the accumulation at over 1 meter in the first 12 hours alone. But accumulation was almost a secondary concern. What defined this storm, what made it the event that older St. John's residents still called simply the storm, as though no clarification were needed, was the wind. At 110, 120, 130 kilometers per hour, the snow didn't fall. It moved. It found every gap, every valley. Time equals 3 milliseconds greater than every sheltered corner between buildings, and it packed itself in with mechanical efficiency. Streets became channels. Channels became drifts. Drifts became walls. By the time the storm exhausted itself 2 days later, drifts in parts of St. John's had reached 9 meters. 9 meters. The height of a 3-story building. Standing on top of them, you could look down onto rooftops. There is a particular quality to blizzard silence that people who have experienced it never quite forget. The wind is screaming. The wind is always screaming. And yet, the city beneath it is utterly still. No cars, no footsteps, no voices. The usual hum of human movement, that background static of civilization, simply stops. St. John's stopped. The streetcars. The city still ran electric streetcars in 1959. Copper wire threading between poles above the major roads were buried where they stood. Drivers abandoned them mid-route and walked home through alleys, or tried to. Several didn't make it home that day. They sheltered with strangers, the way people do when the world turns briefly savage. The harbour, usually an artery of constant commercial activity even in winter, went dark. Ships that had been preparing to sail held position. The pilot boats couldn't move. The loading cranes along Water Street stood frozen under accumulated ice, their arms raised like figures in surrender. Schools closed before most children were even awake, telephone operators placing calls through the night. Hospitals moved to emergency protocols, cancelling scheduled procedures, calling in staff who couldn't come. The Newfoundland Hotel, the city's grandest, found itself hosting 200 people who had intended to be somewhere else entirely. For 48 hours, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the Western Hemisphere simply waited. When you read the phrase 9-meter snowdrifts, the mind processes it as a number. But numbers don't convey what 9 meters of compressed snow actually does. It collapses roofs, structures throughout the city, sheds, outbuildings, older wooden warehouses along the harbour caved under the weight. The loads these roofs were designed to carry, the calculations made by engineers and builders across generations of St. John's winters, had simply been exceeded. The sound of it, residents said, was not dramatic, not a crack or a crash, more of a deep groan, then a thud, then silence again. It traps animals. Livestock in the rural fringe of the city suffocated under drifts before farmers could reach them. Horses were dug out alive after 36 hours. Some weren't dug out alive. It disorients completely. Several individuals became lost within a block of their own homes. The geography of the city, every landmark, every street corner, every familiar edge, had vanished. The snowdrifts didn't follow the logic of streets or fences. They followed the logic of the wind, which followed no logic at all. Men walked in what they were certain was a straight line and found themselves back where they started, or somewhere else entirely. One account, recorded years later by a local historian, described a man who stepped out his back door to check on his coal bin and spent 4 hours finding his way back. His house was 20 meters away. The drifts had rearranged the entire spatial logic of his yard. By February 18th, the storm had moved east into the Atlantic, and St. John's began the slow process of excavation. It took weeks. Time equals 600 milliseconds greater than, not days, weeks. The city deployed every piece of equipment it had, snowplows, loaders, hand crews with shovels, and still the mathematics defeated them. The snow removal crews would clear a street and find that overnight wind had partially refilled it. They would cut a path through a 9-meter drift only to discover another drift waiting behind it. The drifts in some areas of the city were so large, so dense, so structurally coherent that they were treated less like snow and more like terrain. Memorial University students worked alongside city crews. Volunteers materialized from church, halls and union halls. The work was physical and cold and endless, and the city did it anyway, because that's what you do. The last of the major drifts, a formation near the north end of the city that locals had begun calling simply the Wall, wasn't fully cleared until mid-March. Some accounts suggest traces of it survived, in a north-facing shadow, well into April. The final accounting was, in some ways, remarkable for what it wasn't. There were injuries. There was significant property damage. The total estimate ran into millions of $1959. Time equals 5 milliseconds, /. There were livestock lost and vehicles destroyed and roofs that never fully recovered. But the human death toll, given the ferocity of what had descended on the city, was small. The reasons for this say something about St. John's. The city had deep roots in mutual aid, in the culture of checking on your neighbour, of knowing who lived alone and who needed firewood and who couldn't walk well. That culture activated itself before the city's formal emergency systems did. Neighbours appeared at doors. Food moved between households. The isolation the storm created was real, but it never became total. Time equals 450 milliseconds greater than, because the social fabric was denser than the snow. There is an argument, and older residents made it in interviews across the following decades, that St. John's survived not because of its infrastructure, which was overwhelmed, but because of its character. Thomas Parsons shoveled out his truck on February 20th. It took most of the morning. His wife brought him coffee through the window, passing the mug across a drift that was still taller than she was. The truck started on the third try. He sat in it for a moment with the engine running, looking out at Signal Hill, at the narrow harbour entrance through which the Atlantic pushed its cold grey light, at the colourful houses of his city, still half buried, already beginning to emerge. He'd been born in St. John's. He would die in St. John's. The storm had come, as storms always came, and the city had endured, as it always endured. Not through any particular heroism, but through the accumulated weight of people who simply refused to believe the weather was stronger than they were. He put the truck in drive. He had work to do.